I want to expand on this slide with a quick little podcast because the 6 principles of IDEA are probably the most important part of the presentation today because these are the principles that will guide you as a teacher in helping a student find success in your classroom. There are 6 principles, as I stated, that must happen whenever a child qualifies under the IDEA law. So the first one is called zero reject, and this prohibits exclusions of a student from a school due to violations that their behavior may cause due to a disability. And I actually had a case of this in my own school. Many times we have students that have disabilities that are emotional disturbances, and there was a little girl in the kindergarten class where she would have emotional breakdowns each day. And when she was having a breakdown, something would trigger her. She would lash out at the teacher or she would lash out at students. And several times a day, she was hitting and kicking and biting students. Based on the law of IDEA, she was not allowed to be excluded from this classroom because her emotional disability allowed for this behavior. And this is where it gets very tricky because we have to look at the safety of the other children in the classroom, the safety of the teacher, and also the safety of the student that has the disability. So this child was allowed in the classroom for a while. Even with parent complaints, and children were afraid of her, and it really was a bad situation. Eventually, it was determined that she was not best learning in this environment, and she was taken to a different learning environment. But we can't just reject a student based on past experiences. We have to give them a chance in that classroom. And I do want to emphasize that this is public schools must follow the laws of IDEA because they are federally funded, but private schools do not have to follow the laws of IDEA at this time. And we'll talk more about that later in the presentation. The second principle of IDEA looks at the evaluations to determine a child's eligibility for services. And what this principle states is we have to use non-discriminatory and multidisciplinary assessments. So what that just means is a range of assessments, and they always must be administered in the child's first language to determine their need and their true disability. Without thorough evaluations, children are misdiagnosed often. My own daughter was just misdiagnosed. The assessment tool was used correctly, but it was scored improperly, which really changed the outcome of her evaluation, and her services will change. So we need to make sure that we have educated, knowledgeable evaluators and scorers, and that always we're giving those assessments in the child's first language. The third principle is free and appropriate education. And basically, this means that we have to meet the individual needs related to each child's needs and service them, and we can't charge them for that. And that's something that the school picks up the bill for, and it's another reason why private schools want to reject children who need services because those services are expensive. Also, if a public school cannot provide adequate services for a child, they have to pay for them to go to a facility where those service can be rendered to best meet that child. And that's part of this process to help families who need services. The fourth principle of IDEA is the environment. And we want children to be placed in what's called the least restrictive environment. This is the environment that allows a child to learn in its most natural setting. Long ago, historically, special education students were removed from the classroom and put in their own schools or their own classrooms where they did not interact with regular education students at all over the course of the day. And we found that this is not the best learning environment. All students benefit from learning an environment with diversity. and disabilities are a form of diversity. And so students need to be in a classroom where their needs can be met with the least restriction. Um, when their needs are not being met in that regular classroom, then yes, we do need to find a better home for them to learn in. But we always start with the least restrictive environment and the most natural environment. The fifth principle of IDEA is due process, and this is basically to hold schools and parents accountable for the students' rights. To protect their privacy, and it sets a procedure for legal process. If a school or parents are not meeting the needs of a child, it can go to court, and there will be an advocate there to fight for that child's rights. Um, I have a daughter who is in the gifted program, and she has an IEP. And over the course of the last couple years in middle school, she had a teacher who was not meeting the goals set forth in her IEP that they are legally bound to meet. And I've met with the school, and I'm not one to go and sue people, but technically there is a process that involves legal negotiations, and the school could be sued if they don't meet those services. So that process is set in place to help parents usually um, protect their students' rights if they're not being met. The last principle of IDEA is based on participation between parents and schools and students. And this actually talks about the transition from parent into the adolescent stages to help students design and carry out their special education program as they're continuing into the educational process post high school. Um, but always collaboration is important because we want them to grow successfully through this process and keep having their needs met after they've left the traditional school system. So these six principles IDEA guide us as teachers. And again, we're legally bound as teachers and schools to follow these principles under the law.